Salve, friends, and welcome to the Roman Empire in the 2nd century AD. Okay, it's actually a video game. Anno 117 AD Pax Romana, who were cool enough to sponsor this video. They've created the most intricate simulation of the Roman occupation of the British Isles I've ever encountered. I'm Cody Bonds, and I specialize in archaeology for media. And in this video, you'll get a glimpse of some of the very cool historical details the Anno team has included in their game, and learn that the real stars of this Roman city builder are the Celts. As the name of the game suggests, Anno 117 AD Pax Romana is set roughly in the 2nd century of Europe, taking place during the so-called Roman Pax Romana, where they weren't fighting each other internally and instead were focusing on outside wars, with specific attention paid to Italy and the British Isles, called Latium and Albion in-game. The islands you'll encounter represent these well-known places without getting bogged down in specific real-world geography, but you'll recognize them instantly. Latium is still sunny and warm and inhabited by the Romans, and Albion is so misty, windswept, and moist that it takes a special kind of Celtic masochist to stay there. And it's the people who live in these disparate locations and interact with each other and their different values and worldviews that make the game interesting. I went into this thinking Anno was going to be yet another game where you build a civilization as the Romans and then beat up on the barbarous Celts, bringing them civilization with air quotes. Instead, Anno goes to staggering lengths to help model the effects of encroaching Romanization on a culture. No matter if it's in the campaign or free play mode, you'll play as a Roman governor tasked with extracting the wealth from your lands and expanding Roman rule while being watched over by the emperor. Pretty standard stuff so far. But it's when you play in Albion that you see the deeper ideas of the game. Here, you'll encounter the Celts, a people who have recently come into contact with the Romans and are not yet fully absorbed into that empire. As a governor, you can choose to continue embracing local Celtic traditions, or try to focus on a new, hybrid Romano-Celt culture that takes inspiration from distant Latium and eventually displaces the Celtic culture entirely. Some of the local leaders you'll encounter want to keep the old Celtic ways, while the emperor and others will get properly pissed if you reject Roman values in favor of foreign culture. It's a contentious microcosm of personalities that undoubtedly existed at this crossroads of history and is instantly recognizable. My governor was a Celtic alderman the game randomly generated the name Bigus Discus for, which I promise you I did not edit, because clearly the designers for Anno saw me coming a mile away. Other characters you'll encounter are a Silk Road merchant to contend with, a retired Roman general living on his farm, a pampered Greek nobleman's son, the fiery revolutionary Boudica, or even King Arthur gets a knowing historical nod as the would-be leader of an independent Celtic kingdom, so that you're forced to contend with Roman, Celtic, and Romano-Celtic cultures and traditions and aspirations and balance the desires of each. Thankfully in Anno, it's not a case where everything Roman is always better. Anno showcases the rich traditions of the Celtic world with their elaborate woodworking and metalsmithing skills that can only be maintained if you refuse to adopt Roman ways, and there is a desire for a lot of their goods back in Latium. Historically, the Celts' skill in metallurgy is why the Romans invaded them in the first place, as they not only crafted beautiful golden objects, but had invented pattern welding, which twists soft and hard iron together, making it strong yet flexible. There's a reason an entire class of Celtic peoples in-game are just called smiths. Their skills were revered by kings and commoners alike. The Celts found ways to exploit their soggy landscape, building wooden walkways across huge sections of bog, and developing ways to cultivate it, with eel hunting and harvesting reeds for thatching, shoes, and even basketry. Working in and around the water was critically important to the Celts, and when you study them, you'll see the myth of the Lady of the Lake. Religious rituals where swords were bent and then sacrificed by being thrown into the bogs, and even bog bodies, where humans were killed and then placed in the water. And the Celts were surrounded by this marshy stuff. I mean, here's a map of ancient England. All of the light green is marsh, and this is a conservative estimate. That's why there's so much of the stuff you have to build around in an Albion campaign, and why the first level of Celtic society is called waders. They are constantly wading in and out of the water. I mean, it's not a particularly historical name, but it represents the free men of Celtic society who were laborers, just like in Roman society, because there's a lot of parallels between the two. The bottom rung of society is always freed men who work the farms and manual labor jobs, producing the raw resources that the mercantile class then transform into tradable goods and luxury items. And then above them, of course, you have the nobility, who are oftentimes the warrior class and drive the desire for arts, culture, and knowledge. The Celtic nobles, instead of being called the equus, are called eldermen. And that outdated fashion statement you're seeing here is an intentional pre-Roman throwback. A century before, Julius Caesar recorded that bleaching the hair with lye and spiking it was a ritual only allowed after Celtic warriors had killed an enemy in battle. And so you're seeing someone trying to maintain those old ways, wearing a mustache in the face of clean-shaven Romans and keeping their hair long and spiky. These are the old men hardliners who resist change and grumble about the good old days, because what did the Romans ever do for them? Well, for one thing, they can drain the marshes. The Romans took on massive public works projects and physically altered the landscape around them, and so can you. Dikes and drainage systems were dug across England and Northern Europe to reclaim marshy land. You can instantly see the effects of it here. This was a village hemmed in by marsh on both sides with nowhere to expand and go. And suddenly, it can double its population and food capacity with workable fields by just moving the water away. But there's a cost. All that eel fishing and reed gathering that Celtic society is built on depends on those marshes, and when you remove them, those things disappear too, and so does Celtic culture. These industries collapse and are instead replaced by Romanized ones, making them dependent on a Roman style of life and the import of Roman goods, which isn't a problem so long as the trade networks keep functioning, but if they fall apart, you wind up with a society dependent on goods they no longer have access to. And these are the questions that you have to ask when you play the game. What do you value? And depending on who you asked in 1117 AD, switching over to Roman was a good thing. The Romano-Celts smelled opportunity. See, they were early adopters of Roman customs and saw many of the Celtic ways of life as outdated. They craved imported Roman goods and wore Roman-style clothing as status symbols. I mean, in a way, Rome's greatest export was its culture, a lifestyle it wanted everyone to buy into and then consume. It didn't matter where you were from so long as you had money and then spent it on Roman stuff, which is how you get the spread of things like garum. See, the Romans ate garum constantly, and you weren't a Roman unless you ate it all the time and had it available at all your functions, which is surprising because it has been described as rotten fish paste, which is stomach-churning to many of us, but it's also not entirely true. See, many of you have a descendant of garum in your homes. Worcestershire sauce. Like soy sauce and modern Asian fish sauce, it's actually a fermented sauce used as a cooking ingredient in many delicious dishes. I mean, nobody was out there like picking rotting fish up and then chugging garum by the gallon. Garum was instead an exotic luxury good that the Romano-Celts wanted to have around to show how Roman they were, how up and coming. And you see status needs like this represented in game. Old-style Celts want the traditional torques and shields, which are both indicators of status in the older society, while the Romano-Celts want fish sauce and soap. Archaeologically, the social status of a burial is often determined by the amount and the quality of the luxury goods buried with it. Luxury goods are the things you don't need to live and often exist only to show off the wealth and status of the owner, like elaborate brooches, multicolored trousers, and, for a modern example, Lamborghinis. Even the way people worshipped was in flux during this period. Everyone knows the Roman gods like Neptune and Mars, while Ceres is the goddess of grain and harvest, and is the origin of the word cereal. But then you get gods like Mercury Lugos, Well, Lug was the ancient Celtic god of arts and law, and when the Romans first encountered him, they said, hey, that sounds like our god Mercury. So they co-opted him and said, hey, he was just Roman all along. But this wasn't always a one-way street of Roman appropriation. Some Celtic gods did spread across the Roman world. Epona, who many of you will know from the Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time, is the god of horses and speeds up horse carts in-game, while blessing animal husbandry. Cernunnos is another decidedly Celtic deity who we know mainly from the Gundestrup Cauldron, where a wild-looking horned dude sits there surrounded by animals. I mean, it's tough trying to figure out how to interpret a god that we know next to nothing about into a video game, but Anno has him boost the production of goods from marshes and forests, while imparting druidic wisdom to make citizens healthier and smarter. Which is to say, he's generally helping the Celts, as druidic schools are how they generally access knowledge and healthcare. And the lack of those can be quite problematic, as the biggest threats to towns, in-game and historically, are disease and fire. You'd think in a game where you can build forts and raise armies, you'd be under constant threat of attack, and that'd be the real concern. And you are, but when each man in the army has to be drawn from your population and paid to then do nothing but soldier, it's actually quite costly to field large forces and difficult to do so. Fire and disease, though, are ever present in the ancient world, and Anno knows this. The city of London has burned to the ground at least a dozen times that we know of, and this is something the ancients and you can combat by keeping your kilns, bakeries, and smelting operations confined to a separate part of the city. The Romans even developed an early firefighting force called the Vigiles. They roamed the city looking for fires, and when they found one, descended on the area with axes and catapults. Not to put it out, but to destroy every building around it to create a fire break so it didn't consume the entire city. Anno, luckily, is a bit more forgiving. This game is full of little details like this. I mean, festivals have celebrants parading around the streets carrying idols representing whatever the festival god they are cheering for is, and changes depending on the festival. Production of goods is broken into logical increments. You grow or harvest a resource, refine it as needed, and then craft something from it, sometimes combining multiple resources together. Even forestry has been given attention. Often when you play a city building game like this, you'll find any upright tree is quickly felled in the name of progress, entirely deforesting a region by the end of the game. We don't think about forests as cultivated resources, but our ancestors did. What trees were cut and when they were cut was heavily monitored and regulated. Trees were even cut in certain ways to ensure they would grow in the shapes needed. Want lots of small, straight staves? Well, that's pollarding. Every tree had its own purpose. Oak was used for beams, willow was used to weave for wattle and daub, linden trees was the best for shields. Anno doesn't actually go that deep, but I appreciate that the accumulated knowledge you gather in-game can be spent to better understand cultivation and forest management or marshland upkeep, because our ancestors don't get enough credit for recognizing their impact on natural systems and maintain them as renewable sources. I'm a dozen hours into the game, and I feel like I've barely scratched the surface for how you can interact with it and manipulate the world. It's a truly breathtaking scale and scope, with the ability to switch between regions at will and a map that seems to promise even more regions spread across the far-flung Roman Empire. Anno is a game about expanding the might of Rome, while deciding how much of those pesky foreign cultures you want to keep, or squash out, or maybe pushing back against Rome entirely. And these are all decisions you'll have to make, because after all, Rome wasn't built in a day, and you surely won't be able to build it in one day here. If you're interested, Anno 117 AD Pax Romana is available November 13th on Steam, Ubisoft Connect, Epic, Xbox, and PlayStation. And thanks again to Anno for sponsoring this video. It was tremendously fun to play, and thank you for watching. Now, go forth and conquer, because that's what I'm about to get back to doing.